The desert borderlands of New Mexico had always been a place where stories grew faster than plants. The land was wide and empty, the air dry as old paper, and the sky so huge that people often felt small beneath it. In towns scattered across the dusty roads, folks found comfort in telling stories. Stories about things they did not fully understand, people they had never met, and mysteries that filled the long, quiet nights. Among all these stories, one name echoed more than any other: the giant widow. Some spoke it with a touch of fear, some with a curious smile, and some with the uneasy tone of someone who wasn't sure if they were sharing a tale or a truth. She lived somewhere near the far edge of the desert, beyond the last stretch of broken fences and dried riverbeds, in a place where almost nobody went unless they had a reason. People claimed she was unusually tall, with broad shoulders, and a presence that could fill a room even when she didn't say a word. No one could agree on her exact height or appearance, because very few people had ever seen her up close. Most of the stories came from travelers passing through, people who had camped near her land, or tried to cross it without knowing it belonged to someone. They returned with wide eyes and dramatic gestures, saying she had stepped out of the shadows like a figure from a dream. Some claimed she spoke with a deep, calm tone that made them freeze in place. Others said she didn't need to speak at all. Her simple presence was enough to send them turning back the way they came. Because of this, the legend grew. People began saying that no white man had ever survived a meeting with her. At first, the words sounded harsh, but most understood it wasn't meant literally. It was simply a way of expressing how strong and intimidating she appeared to strangers. Men who came across her land usually left so quickly, and with such dramatic stories, that others assumed their experience must have been unbearable. In truth, they had mostly scared themselves. The desert was strange for people who weren't used to it, and the giant widow, living alone for years, didn't always greet unexpected visitors with warm smiles. Still, the legend was enough to make people whisper her name instead of saying it out loud. Nobody knew her real story. Some believed she had once been happily married, living a simple life with her husband, until he passed away unexpectedly. Others said she had lived alone long before that, and the word widow was only a nickname meant to add mystery. The truth was probably somewhere in between. What people did know was that she stayed on her land after her husband was gone, keeping the place running on her own. That alone earned a sort of quiet respect. The desert was not easy on anyone, let alone a woman living alone. The heat could drain a person. The nights could chill them to the bone, and the wind sometimes carried strange whistles that made even strong men uneasy. But she stayed, repairing her fences, tending to her animals, and minding her own business. Still, her size and strength made people talk. Some said she could carry a load of firewood in one trip when it took others 3. Some said she walked through sandstorms without covering her face. Some said they saw her lifting heavy supplies that would normally require 2 people. Whether any of these claims were true didn't matter to the storytellers. Every time someone repeated the tale, they added their own twist, shaping her into a figure larger than life. The widow rarely came into town, but when she did, people noticed. She walked with a steady step, her face calm and serious, as if she didn't care about the whispers around her. Some folks respected her independence and admired her quiet dignity. Others stepped aside, unsure of what to say or do. She never caused trouble. She simply bought what she needed: flour, tools, cloth, and sometimes books, and left without lingering. But even those short visits kept the legend alive. Children peeked from behind their parents, whispering about her height. Travelers stared openly, wondering if she was the same person from the stories they had heard on the road. Because she lived in a remote area, her land sometimes confused people who came from far away. The borders were not marked clearly, and new travelers often wandered onto her property without knowing. Those who did usually returned with a story. They said she stood in front of them without making a sound, simply observing. Not angry, not threatening, just watchful. As someone who had lived alone long enough to be careful, many visitors took her silence as a sign of displeasure and hurried away, their imaginations filling the gaps. By the time they reached town, their simple encounter had turned into something far more dramatic. And so the tale grew stronger. traveling from one person to another like dry leaves carried by the wind. Some locals found humor in the exaggeration and joked gently about it. Others believed every word. In places where people lived so far apart, stories had a way of becoming entertainment. The giant widow became a kind of legend, something to talk about in barbershops, general stores, and late-night gatherings. Some men even made bets, claiming they would ride out and meet her themselves someday, only to quietly drop the idea when the time came. It wasn't fear exactly, it was simply the unknown. Meeting someone who had become a myth made people nervous. Yet behind all the stories, the widow lived her days in steady rhythm. She rose early, fed her animals, repaired broken boards, cooked her meals, and kept to herself. She liked the quiet. The desert had a certain peace that comforted her. The endless horizon reminded her of her younger days when she and her husband had first dreamed of building a home together. Though he was gone, she kept the land alive for both of them. When she worked, she sometimes hummed soft tunes from her childhood. When she rested, she read old letters and kept memories close. People saw her as mysterious, but in truth, she simply valued her privacy. Still, the legend refused to fade. Travelers who camped near her land told stories of hearing footsteps in the night, steady, unhurried steps that they believed were hers. Some said they saw her silhouette against the moonlight, tall and unmoving, like a guardian watching the land. Whether those sightings were real or tricks of the desert night, nobody knew. But the stories continued to build, shaping her into a figure that drifted between reality and imagination. In a nearby town, folks told newcomers, "If you ever meet her, stay respectful. She's not one to play games." They didn't mean any harm. It was simply their way of showing that even legends deserved courtesy. People learned to treat her land with quiet care, avoiding it unless they had a real need to pass through. The desert was big, and giving her space was easy enough. But one thing remained steady in every version of her story: the belief that no white man had ever survived a meeting with her. Of course, people didn't mean she had hurt anyone. They meant that every person who had tried to speak with her or question her had come back flustered, embarrassed, or overwhelmed. They returned with shaky voices and wild gestures, saying they would never repeat the experience. It became a joke among locals, a way to tease travelers who thought they could handle anything. Still, the legend grew stronger over the years, turning into something people repeated without thinking. The idea shaped the way they viewed her, painting her as a powerful figure who stood outside the ordinary world. But legends have a way of changing. And soon, someone new would test the old story, someone who didn't believe in tales or warnings. A wealthy rancher with a curious mind and a strong sense of confidence would ride toward her land, not knowing that his journey would change the way people spoke about the giant widow forever. Edward Mallory, known to most people simply as Eddie, had grown up in the borderlands and had seen more than his share of unusual things. He owned one of the largest ranches in the region, acres of open land where his cattle grazed under the wide, sunny skies. His family had built the ranch long before he was born, and he had inherited it after his father retired. Eddie was wealthy by local standards, but anyone who truly knew him understood that he cared more about the land than the money it brought. He rose early, worked with his ranch hands, repaired broken gates with his own hands, and treated every animal with gentle patience. He was the kind of man who believed that hard work kept the mind clear. Eddie had heard stories about the giant widow for years, but he never gave them much thought. In his view, stories were just stories, things that grew in retelling, shaped more by imagination than truth. Whenever people whispered warnings or tried to impress newcomers with tales of her size and mystery, Eddie simply smiled. He believed that most folk tales were built from misunderstandings. People saw something they didn't know how to explain, and their minds filled the gaps. Eddie preferred facts. Facts didn't change with each storyteller, but one season, something unusual began happening on his ranch. A few of his cattle went missing, not many, but enough for him to notice. At first, he assumed they had wandered off, as cattle sometimes did, but when days passed without any sign of them, he grew curious. He talked to his ranch hands, asked them if they'd seen anything strange. But no one had. They suggested it might be animals from the wild, but Eddie wasn't convinced. Cattle usually left clear tracks, and predators rarely dragged animals far. Still, the desert was unpredictable, so he kept an open mind. Then came a day when one of his hands mentioned something that made Eddie pause. Some of the tracks lead toward the far border, the ranch hand said. Toward the widow's land. Eddie raised his eyebrows. Are you sure? As sure as anyone can be in the desert, the man answered with a small shrug. Eddie wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but the mention of the giant widow stirred old tales in his memory. He didn't believe she would cause trouble on purpose. Everything he had heard about her suggested she kept to herself, avoiding unnecessary contact with strangers. But he knew one thing. If his missing cattle had wandered onto her land, he needed to talk to her. Not accuse, not confront, just talk. The desert didn't care about borders, but ranchers did. Respecting landlines was important. His friends, however, did not share his calm view. When he mentioned his plan at the local cafe, people stared at him as if he had just said he planned to walk into a storm without shelter. You're going to her land? One man asked, spilling a bit of his coffee. Do you know what folks say? Eddie laughed softly. I know what stories say. Stories aren't facts. Another man leaned forward. No white man survives meeting her. Eddie shook his head. You mean no man leaves without feeling shaken? That's different. She's not hurting anyone. She just lives alone. But the men didn't look convinced. They exchanged the kind of glances people give when they think someone is making a foolish choice. One older gentleman spoke up from the corner, his tone more gentle than the others. Eddie, she's lived a hard life. People talk because they don't understand her. Doesn't mean she's dangerous. Just be respectful. Eddie nodded. That part made sense. He tended to treat everyone with fairness, and he planned to show the same respect to the widow. Still, as he prepared for the trip, he felt a small flutter of curiosity. Not fear, just a wondering. Who was she really? What kind of life had shaped the legend people whispered about? He saddled his horse early the next morning, packed water, a small supply of food, and carried only what he needed. He also brought a simple gift of dried fruit, something polite to offer if he ended up at her doorstep. Courtesy mattered to him. The desert morning was cool, the air crisp enough to feel refreshing on his face. The sun had barely risen when he rode out, leaving behind the familiar fences and fields of his ranch. As he traveled farther, the land grew quieter. That was the thing about the desert. The farther you went, the more it seemed to breathe differently, as if it held secrets underneath the sand. Eddie followed the tracks left by his missing cattle as best as he could, though the desert wind sometimes erased them. When the ground grew too smooth to read properly, he relied on his instincts. Years of riding through the borderlands had taught him how to tell where a herd might wander. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, warming the land. Eddie wiped his brow and drank from his canteen. He wasn't worried this was familiar territory, but he did feel a spark of anticipation as he approached the region where the widow supposedly lived. The land changed subtly. The ground rose into low, rolling hills. A cluster of old scrub trees cast thin shadows across the dirt. The fences he passed looked repaired many times, the kind of work done by someone with strong hands and careful attention. Eddie slowed his horse. He knew he was close. He didn't want to appear as if he had barged in uninvited. So he called out softly a few times as he rode, announcing himself. Not loud, not demanding, just politely. Hello there, passing through. Anyone around? The only answer was the whisper of wind through dry grass. Eddie continued, his posture relaxed but attentive. Then, as he rounded a small bend, he saw her. She stood near a tall wooden post, working with a coil of rope. She was exactly as people described, tall, broad-shouldered, and strong, in a way that came from years of physical labor. Her posture was steady, her movements smooth, almost quiet. Eddie stopped his horse several yards away and lifted a hand in greeting. Morning, he called gently. The widow turned her head. Her expression wasn't harsh or angry, it was simply cautious, the way someone looks when a stranger arrives unexpectedly. She didn't step back, didn't appear startled. She simply watched him with calm, steady eyes. Eddie removed his hat politely. "Name's Edward Mallory. Folks call me Eddie. I live a few miles from here." She didn't smile, but she nodded slightly in acknowledgement. He continued in his easy, respectful tone. "Some of my cattle seem to have wandered off. I thought they might have come this way. I just wanted to ask if you'd seen them." For a moment, she didn't answer. Eddie didn't mind the silence. He understood that people who lived alone often took their time before speaking. Finally, she said, "I've seen tracks. Didn't see the animals. They may have gone north." Her voice was deep, but not unpleasant. It had a quiet strength, like someone who spoke only when she had something real to say. Eddie nodded. "Thank you. I appreciate the help." Crossed. He felt no fear. If anything, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. She reminded him of the kind of people the desert shaped: strong, private, and honest, the kind of people his grandfather used to respect. For a moment, neither spoke. Eddie considered offering the dried fruit, but he sensed that the moment wasn't right yet. Instead, he simply said, "I hope you don't mind me coming through. I meant no trouble." The widow looked at him for a long moment, her gaze calm and measured. Then she said, "People rarely come out this far unless they're lost." Eddie smiled lightly. "Or looking for cattle." Her expression softened just enough to show she understood. Then, as if the desert wanted to shift the day, a distant rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Eddie looked up. Dark clouds gathered faster than he expected. Desert storms often arrived without much warning. He turned back toward the widow. She had already begun securing her tools, preparing for the weather. Eddie knew he might not have enough time to ride home before the storm hit. The widow glanced at him, and then at the sky before saying, "There's shelter ahead." She nodded toward a cluster of canvas structures partially hidden behind a hill. Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't cold either. It was practical. Eddie realized she was offering him a place to wait out the storm. And just like that, the legend that had lived for years in whispered stories was about to change for both of them. The sky darkened so quickly that Eddie almost wondered if the desert was playing tricks on him. One moment, the sun had been shining brightly over the hills, and the next, a blanket of gray clouds rolled in, thick and heavy. The air changed too. It grew cooler, with a soft breeze that carried the smell of rain. Eddie had lived in the borderlands long enough to know that desert storms didn't move slowly. They came with purpose, sweeping across the land before anyone had time to prepare. He looked toward the horizon and saw a faint shimmer of lightning far away, stretching across the sky like a thin, bright line. The widow glanced at the same sky, then at Eddie. She didn't rush, but she moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had seen many storms before. She knew how to read the weather. She knew what came next. Without raising her voice, she motioned for him to follow her toward the shelter she had mentioned. Eddie guided his horse beside her as they walked. The ground beneath them felt different, cooler, softer, as the air grew more humid. The widow's steps were confident. She walked as though she didn't fear the storm at all, as though she and the weather shared some silent understanding. Eddie respected that. People who lived long in the desert often developed a quiet connection to it. As they approached the hill she had pointed toward, Eddie finally saw the shelter clearly. It wasn't a house or cabin. Instead, a large canvas tent stood firmly anchored between two wooden posts. The tent was spacious, built with care, its thick fabric protected by extra layers to keep out the wind and rain. Beside it stood a smaller storage structure, which Eddie guessed held tools or supplies. The tent's shape told him it had been there for a long time. Someone had put a lot of thought into keeping it strong and safe. The widow ducked slightly as she entered the tent. Eddie followed, holding the entrance flap so the wind wouldn't whip it out of his hands. Inside, the tent felt surprisingly warm and welcoming. It had a simple layout: a sturdy table, two wooden stools, a few crates for storage, and a thick rug spread across the floor. A small lantern hung from a hook, giving off a soft glow. The faint smell of herbs and dried wood lingered gently in the air. The storm outside began to grow louder. Rain tapped softly on the canvas at first, then gradually stronger, as drops fell in steady rhythm. Eddie listened for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. Desert rain had a different voice than city rain. It carried a feeling of renewal, a promise that the land would breathe easier after the storm passed. The widow removed her heavy outer shawl, shook off the dust, and hung it near the entrance. Eddie did the same with his coat. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her calm movements suggested that everything was in order, and she knew exactly how to handle the storm. She pointed to a stool. "Sit if you like." Her tone wasn't warm, but it wasn't unfriendly either. Simply practical. Eddie took the seat, grateful for the chance to rest. He had been riding most of the morning, and his legs felt the weight of the journey. For a while, they sat quietly as the rain picked up strength. The tent rustled gently in the wind, but the structure held firm. Eddie could tell she had built it with care. Everything had a place. The tools were neatly arranged. The crates were stacked evenly. A small pot of water rested on a metal stand, ready to be heated if needed. The silence didn't feel awkward. It felt natural. People who lived alone often didn't fill the air with unnecessary words. Eddie respected that. He himself didn't enjoy noisy conversation. He liked peace, clarity, and practical talk. After several minutes, the widow finally spoke. "You were looking for cattle." Her voice was low but steady, blending with the sound of rain outside. "Yes," Eddie replied. "A few wandered off. I'm hoping they didn't go far." She nodded, thoughtful. "They may return after the storm. Animals usually look for dry ground when weather changes." Eddie smiled faintly. "You know this land well." She didn't respond with pride or modesty. She simply said, "I've lived here a long time." Eddie sensed that she didn't like talking about herself, so he didn't push. Instead, he shared something lighter. "Sometimes I think the cattle know more about weather than I do," he said with a soft chuckle. One corner of her mouth lifted, not a full smile, but enough to show she appreciated the comment. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the canvas like thousands of tiny hands. The air inside the tent stayed warm though, thanks to the thick fabric and the way the structure blocked the wind. Eddie felt grateful for the shelter. If he had been caught in the open, the storm might have soaked him and made the ride home unpleasant. The widow's quiet offer of refuge had saved him from hours of discomfort. She reached into a crate and pulled out a small cloth pouch. From it, she took a handful of dried leaves, placing them in a pot of water. Then she lit a small flame beneath the pot, heating it slowly. Eddie watched, curious. "Tea?" She nodded. "Herbal, from plants that grow near the rocks." He had never tasted desert herbs before, but he trusted her knowledge. The scent that filled the tent was gentle and calming, earthy with a faint sweetness. When the tea was ready, she poured some into a clay cup and handed it to him. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She poured a cup for herself and sat opposite him. They sipped quietly, letting the warmth spread through them. The tea had a comforting flavor. Not too strong, not too weak. Eddie felt the tension of the long ride slip away. After a few more moments of peaceful silence, the widow asked, "Why did you come yourself? Most ranchers send workers." Eddie shrugged lightly. "It's my responsibility. I don't like assuming things without seeing for myself." She studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. "Most people avoid this area. I don't see a reason to avoid it," Eddie replied gently. "It's your home. Homes deserve respect." Something in her expression softened, not visibly, but in the way she held her shoulders, in the slight relaxation of her hands. Eddie noticed, but didn't mention it. The conversation flowed slowly but naturally. He learned that she grew her own herbs, collected rainwater in barrels, and repaired every structure on her land with her own hands. She didn't brag, nor did she speak with bitterness. She simply shared facts, the way someone would talk about everyday chores. Eddie found himself admiring her resilience. Living alone in the desert required strength, Not the kind people exaggerated in stories, but quiet, steady strength that came from experience and patience. Outside, the storm calmed slightly. The rain softened, the wind grew gentle, and light filtered through the clouds, casting a faint glow inside the tent. Eddie took another sip of tea and looked around. "People in town talk a lot about you," he said carefully, wanting to be respectful. The widow didn't react with surprise. "They talk because they don't know me." "That's true," Eddie agreed. "But sometimes stories grow bigger than the truth." She looked at him directly. "What story did they tell you?" Her tone wasn't sharp, just curious. Eddie chose his words with honesty. "They say no white man survives meeting you." The widow blinked slowly, processing the words, not offended, just reflective. "And yet you are here," she said quietly. Eddie smiled. "Yes." Seems the story was a bit exaggerated. A soft breath escaped her, maybe a sigh, maybe a quiet laugh. It was hard to tell, but Eddie sensed she wasn't upset. If anything, she seemed relieved that someone finally understood how exaggerated the tales were. The storm outside continued to fade. The rain slowed to a gentle mist, tapping lightly against the canvas like soft fingers. Eddie stood and peeked outside. The sky was brighter now, washed clean by the rain. The air smelled fresh, carrying the scent of wet earth. He turned back toward her. "Looks like the worst has passed." She nodded. "You can head back soon. The ground will dry fast." Eddie didn't rush, though. He felt the day had shifted in an unexpected but meaningful way. He had come looking for lost cattle, but he had found something more. A glimpse of truth behind a story, and a sense of respect for someone who had lived quietly under the weight of other people's tales. Before leaving, he reached into his pack and gently placed the pouch of dried fruit on her table. "A small thank you," he said. She looked at it, then at him. "You didn't need to bring anything." "I wanted to," he replied softly. She accepted it with a nod, simple, honest. As the sky cleared, Eddie prepared his horse. The widow stepped outside with him, watching the open land with calm eyes. The world looked brighter after the rain, as though the desert itself had taken a deep breath. Eddie mounted his horse and looked back at her. "Thank you for the shelter." "You're welcome," she said. He rode away slowly, the memory of her calm presence settling into his thoughts. He didn't know it yet, but the story people whispered would soon change because Eddie had survived meeting the giant widow. And not only survived, but shared her shelter, her tea, and a quiet moment in the middle of a desert storm. When Eddie rode away from the widow's land, the world felt different, not just the land around him, but something inside him as well. The storm had washed the desert clean, leaving the air cool and gentle. The sun peeked out from behind the clouds, spreading soft light over the hills. Water collected in small pools between rocks, and the scent of wet soil drifted through the breeze. Eddie breathed it in slowly, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He glanced back once, hoping to see the widow still standing near her tent. She was there, quiet and steady, watching the land instead of him. She didn't wave, didn't call out, but somehow her presence felt like a silent farewell. Eddie nodded to himself and began the ride home. The path was easier now that the storm had passed. The ground was damp but firm, and the air was cool enough that Eddie didn't feel tired. As he rode, he thought about the stories people told about her. Every tale he had heard suddenly felt thin and empty compared to the person he had met. She wasn't frightening. She wasn't harsh. She wasn't mysterious in the way people described. She was simply a strong woman, living a quiet life in a place that required patience and courage. People had misunderstood her because they didn't know her. And sometimes, Eddie realized, people feared what they didn't understand. He reached his ranch by late afternoon. The ranch hands greeted him with wide eyes. "Boss, you're back already?" one asked, sounding half surprised and half impressed. "Storm passed quicker than I expected," Eddie replied with an easy smile. Another hand stepped forward. Did you find her?" Eddie dismounted and patted his horse gently. "I did." The men exchanged uneasy glances, the kind that carried old stories and whispered warnings. "Well?" one of them asked, his voice lowered. Eddie removed his hat and brushed the dust from it while thinking of the right words. He wanted to speak honestly, but he also wanted to be respectful of the widow's privacy. She was polite, he said simply. Quiet. Helpful. The ranch hands blinked as if he had spoken a foreign language. Helpful? One repeated. Yes, she showed me where the tracks went, offered shelter when the storm came. Eddie didn't mention the tea or their quiet conversation, but he didn't have to. The truth was enough. For a moment, the men were silent. Then one laughed nervously. Well, you're the first man to come back smiling, he said, shaking his head. Eddie smiled again, though this time with a softer expression. That's because people misunderstand her. She's strong, yes, but she isn't what people say. The men listened carefully. Some looked relieved, some puzzled, and some still unsure. But Eddie didn't push them. He knew change took time. The stories had been around for years. They wouldn't disappear overnight. Days passed. The desert warmed again. The puddles dried. The sky returned to its wide, endless blue. Eddie resumed his normal routine, feeding the animals, checking the fences, and riding across the land. But every now and then, he found himself thinking about the widow's calm voice, her steady hands, and the way she had quietly offered him shelter without expecting anything in return. One afternoon, a ranch hand approached him. Boss, some of the cattle came back, he said. Probably found their way home after the storm. Just like she said. Eddie nodded. He wasn't surprised. The widow had known the land better than anyone he had ever met. A few more days passed before Eddie made a decision. He packed a few supplies, some flour, dried fruit, a coil of good rope, and a new kettle. Simple things. Useful things. He placed them carefully in his saddlebag. When one of his workers noticed, he asked, "Heading out again?" Eddie simply replied, "Just paying a visit." He rode out early in the morning, choosing the same path he had taken before. The desert looked peaceful, under the golden light of sunrise. Birds hopped between the shrubs, and the air felt crisp. When he reached the widow's land, he didn't call out immediately. He wanted to be respectful, not intrusive. As he approached the area near her tent, he found her repairing a wooden barrel. She looked up, calm and unsurprised. "You're back," she said. Eddie smiled gently. "I brought a few things. Thought they might be useful." She watched him for a moment, then nodded once. "You can leave them on the table." He followed her into the tent. The inside was just as he remembered, simple, neat, and quiet. He placed the supplies on the table and stepped back. "You didn't have to bring anything," she said, her tone even. "I know," he replied. "But I wanted to. Consider it a thank you. For the shelter." She didn't smile, but her eyes softened slightly, a tiny shift that Eddie noticed. They shared a cup of herbal tea again, the same calming scent filling the tent. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence between them felt comfortable, the kind that grows from respect rather than unfamiliarity. When Eddie finally left, she walked him part way, stopping at the edge of her land. He turned and tipped his hat. "Take care," he said. "You too," she replied. After that day, Eddie visited her land every few weeks, not often, not in a way that would disturb her peace. Sometimes he brought supplies. Sometimes he simply checked on the tracks near the border to make sure cattle didn't wander too far. And every time, the widow greeted him with the same steady calm. Word of his visits eventually reached the town, as news always did in quiet places. At first, people gossiped. "Eddie Mallory keeps riding out to see her," some whispered. "Maybe he's trying to solve a mystery," others joked. But Eddie didn't care for rumors. He wasn't visiting for attention. He was visiting because he respected her, because he admired her strength, and because he understood the value of honest connection. Slowly, the stories about the giant widow began to change. People still spoke of her size and strength, but their tone shifted. They talked less about fear and more about curiosity. They asked Eddie questions and he answered honestly. "She's not dangerous," he would say calmly. "She's private. She works hard. She minds her own business." People listened, and although not everyone understood, the harsh edges of the old legend began to soften. The idea that no white man survived meeting her faded into a joke rather than a warning, something said with a smile, not with fear. Season after season passed. The desert changed colors as it always did. Green after rain, golden under the sun, soft and pale under the moonlight. And through all those seasons, the widow remained on her land, strong and steady. Eddie remained on his ranch, managing his animals with the same patience as always. Their friendship, quiet, respectful, and genuine, continued to grow. Eddie realized something important the more he visited her. She hadn't needed saving. She hadn't needed help. All she had needed was someone willing to see her for who she truly was, not for who the stories claimed she was. And he, in turn, learned something from her calm presence. He learned that strength didn't always need to be loud. That peace could come from simple routines. And that understanding grew best in quiet places, shared in small moments rather than grand speeches. One evening, months after their first meeting, Eddie sat on his porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with shades of orange, pink, and purple. He smiled softly, thinking about the way the light fell across the hills, the same hills that led to the widow's land. People would always tell stories. That was simply human nature. But sometimes, the best stories were the ones that changed over time. Stories that taught people to look again, to see the truth behind old misunderstandings. And Eddie knew one thing for certain: the legend would never be the same again, because one man had met the giant widow, shared her tent during a storm, and walked away with respect instead of fear. Not a tale of danger, but a story of understanding. A story that would last far longer than any whisper carried by the desert wind.